Our text for this morning's sermon is Genesis 37. Genesis 37. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in his mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "Are your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" And they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. The grass withers and the flower fades, but surely the word of our God stands firm and sure forevermore. Beloved congregation of our Lord Jesus Christ, one of the most remarkable things about the way that we have been created is that God has designed us in a way that we are hardwired to respond to the power of story. In fact, psychologists have discovered that stories are actually one of the most important ways that we both give and receive information. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that when God speaks to us in His Word, He often uses stories as a way of communicating with us. Now, in one sense, the Scriptures are a collection of books that tell us a multitude of individual stories. But in a larger sense, the Bible is a singular book that tells us a singular story. And the story that the Scriptures recount is the story of salvation. This is the story of everything that God has chosen to do in order to redeem a people from sin. Now that story begins in Genesis 3:15. And that is where God came to Adam and Eve as they stood trembling before Him in the garden, and He told them that He was going to respond to their rebellion by making a way of salvation for sinners. And God promised that that way of salvation, that it would come to them in a son who would be born of woman, and a son who would free them from the power of sin by crushing the head of the serpent. And from that point on, what unfolds is the grand narrative of redemptive history as God works in time and as He works in the lives of His people in an order to fulfill the very promises of salvation that He has made to them. Now, the passage that is before us this morning, it alerts us to the fact that it functions as a new chapter in that unfolding drama, that unfolding story of salvation. That is clear to us from what we read in verse 2. In verse 2, we are told that these are the generations of Jacob. Now, that is God's way of telling us that even though we are about to read all about the life of Joseph, this is actually the next chapter in a much larger story. And that is because Joseph's story, well, it's really part and parcel of a family story. It's a family history that we're going to read about. And it's a family history that stretches back to Joseph's forebearers. And we're thinking here about the patriarchs, about Abraham, about Isaac, and about Jacob. And it is clear to us from what has been revealed in the preceding chapters that this family, Jacob's family, this is the family of promise. This is the family that has graciously received God's covenant promises of salvation. But the details of this passage, they don't just encourage us to look back, they also encourage us to look ahead as well. That happens in verse 3. Notice how in verse 3, Jacob is referred to by his new name which is Israel. And that shift, that alerts us to the fact that in the providence of God, this family, well, they're going to become a people. They will, in fulfillment of the promise that God had made to Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, they are going to become a great nation, one that will be led to dwell in the very land that God had promised to give to Abraham so very long ago. And so in the opening verses of this passage, God is telling us that Joseph's story, the narrative of Joseph's life, well, it's something that needs to be understood as being part of that grand narrative of salvation that the Scriptures recount. Now, if you're someone who is a reader and you read a lot, then you will know that in any book, there are some chapters, there are some sections of that book that are going to be more consequential than others. And I mean that in the sense that there are some chapters which really drive the plot forward. There are some chapters that really advance the narrative, so to speak. And that is very much the case here. Because the story of Joseph is really the culmination. It's really the climax to which the entire book of Genesis has been building. And that's because Joseph is how we get to Egypt. And it's in Egypt that Jacob's family is going to become a people. It's there that they're going to become a nation. But even more importantly, Egypt will be for them a place of suffering and slavery. But God is going to come to them in that place, and he's going to lift them out of that bondage. And he's going to do so by the mighty works of his hands. And what we need to understand is that Egypt, it will become a place of exodus for God's people. And this is the turning point then between these two books. All of Genesis has been building to Joseph so that in Joseph we can transition to Egypt, and from Egypt to Exodus. And along the way, we will see God at work fulfilling his promises of salvation. But before any of that can happen, God will first need to rescue this family. Because before this family can become a people, before they can become a nation that will be a light on a hill, before they can have the possibility of becoming a way of salvation for others, they are first going to need to be saved themselves. And just like every act of salvation, that is going to require the powerful and the gracious intervention of our God. Our God who sovereignly ordains the events of history in such a way that they are made to serve his purposes. And our God, who is the only God who is capable of transforming the way of suffering into a way of redemption for his people. And if we consider the first act of Joseph's story as we find it recorded for us in Genesis 37, this is precisely what we find God doing. We find him intervening into the lives of his people. We find him at work in history to fulfill these promises. And in an effort to come to a greater understanding of how God has accomplished that work of salvation, we want to consider three facets of this chapter. We want to think, first of all, about the mess. The mess, then we want to think about the machinations, and finally we want to think about the mystery. The mess, the machinations, and the mystery. Those are the three facets of this text that we want to focus on this morning. Now, we've already noted that if the people of Israel, if they were going to become a way of salvation for others, then the family of Jacob would first need to be saved themselves. And that is because this family is nothing short of a hot mess. And the reason that they are in such shambles is because there was enmity. There was enmity between them. In fact, as the text repeatedly tells us, they actually hated one another. Or more precisely, they hated Joseph. Now, there has been a long-standing tradition of blaming Joseph for this sad state of affairs. And that is because we're told that at times Joseph seems to have acted in a number of very unwise and very provocative ways. So we're told in verse 2, for instance, that Joseph brought a bad report of his brother's behavior to his father. And the suggestion has been that Joseph is a tattletale. That he's a tattletale who is eager to rat out his brothers and to get them in trouble with dad. And Joseph may well have been so. Although it is possible that all that Joseph had done was to bring an honest report that had been requested of him by his father. And so it may be the case that all that Joseph has done is to bring an honest record of the immoral and the unwise behavior of his brothers to his father. Of course, there's also the fact that Joseph had made a point of telling his family about the dreams that he had had. And given that his dreams suggested that one day he would end up being served by both his parents and his siblings, that might seem like a rather arrogant and pretentious thing to have done. And there's no doubt that that is how Jacob's siblings and Jacob's parents interpreted his decision to tell them about the dreams that he'd had. And the point here is that there has been a tendency then to single Joseph out as the source of the family's tensions. And look, if you have ever been a 17-year-old boy, or if you have ever had occasion to parent a 17-year-old boy, then you will know that they have a proven track record of acting without much in the way of wisdom or humility. 17-year-old boys do tend to have real trouble seeing beyond themselves. And so it might not be unreasonable to imagine that Joseph's behavior, that it contributed to the mess of this situation. At the same time, however, if you look closely at the text, what it suggests is that whatever shortcomings Joseph might have had, that the real source of the problem was the brothers. Notice how in every instance, it is actually the hatred of the brothers that is emphasized. And so it is the state of their heart that really seems to be the issue. And notice that the text, it doesn't just tell us that the brothers hated Joseph. The text also tells us why they hated him. In fact, we're given 3 reasons for their animosity. Now, the first of those reasons was their father's favoritism. Now, again, at one level, it isn't surprising that Jacob might have had a particular fondness for Joseph. Joseph was, after all, the son of his true love. Right? Joseph was Rachel's son. Rachel, whom he had loved with all his heart. Rachel, who had given him children in his old age. Rachel, who had died giving birth to Benjamin. And so we can feel a measure of sympathy for Jacob. Because there's no doubt that when Jacob looked at Joseph, he saw in Joseph a living legacy of Rachel's love. The trouble, however, was that rather than keeping those affections hidden in his heart, Jacob displayed those feelings. And so the whole family knew that he had a special fondness for Joseph. And consequently, Joseph's brothers, they resented him for that. And that open favoritism, it led to the second reason for their hatred, and that was this coat that Jacob gives to Joseph. Now, here's the thing about that coat. We don't really know what it looked like. We can't be certain whether it was a coat of many colors or whether this was a coat that just had been heavily embroidered in some way. But what we do know about this coat is that it was a lordly coat. This was a coat that had been constructed in such a way that it conveyed a sense of prestige. It conveyed a sense of preeminence. And it suggested that the one who wore it occupied an exalted position. And Joseph's brothers, they resented the not-so-subtle implication that their younger brother somehow occupied a more exalted station than they did. And their concerns about Joseph's implied preeminence, that leads us to think about the most important reason for their hatred. And there was one reason above all else that they hated Joseph, and that reason was his dreams. It was the dreams that more than anything else really provoked their hatred. That's clear from what we read in verse 8. We're told that when they had heard of his dreams, they didn't just hate him, they hated him all the more. It's also clear from what we read in verse 20. There we're told that when the brothers decide that they're going to put Joseph to death, a key part of their motivation was that they wanted to put an end to the dreams. The dreaming really bothered them. Now, the thing that we have to recognize is why their hatred of Joseph's dreams is so important to this story. And the key here is to remember that if you look back throughout the book of Genesis, dreams were one of the primary ways in which God spoke to his people. In that sense, and again, remember that we're dealing with a point in redemptive history where the Bible has not yet been written. And so there is no scripture for them to turn to. And in that context, dreams are one of God's primary ways of revelation. And this was a family that would have known that, because this was a family that had received dreams from the Lord. Jacob had himself received a dream from the Lord when he had been at Bethel. Do you remember that Jacob, when he is sleeping that night, when he has a rock for a pillow, he has a dream about a ladder that connects heaven and earth. And Jacob sees angels ascending and descending on that ladder. And in the midst of that dream, God says to Jacob, I will be with you. I will go with you wherever you go, and I will be the one to establish you. Jacob had received himself a dream from the Lord. And this is perhaps why we're told in verse 11 that while the brothers hated Joseph on account of his dreams, that Jacob kept these things in his mind. I'm reminded here of what Mary will do later when Gabriel comes. She will ponder these things in her heart. Jacob seems to have recognized that there was an element of revelation to this dream. He kept it in his mind. He thought about it. Joseph's brothers, however, hated him. They hated him on account of these dreams. And in responding this way, they showed that what they really hated was the will of God. Because it should have been clear to them that it was God who was speaking to Joseph in these dreams, and it should have been clear to them that God was expressing his will, that he was expressing his sovereign choice of their brother, and they ought to have responded by humbly submitting themselves to the Lord's will. And they ought to have done so in the confidence that God was acting in faithfulness to the promises that he had made to their family, the promises that he'd made to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. But that isn't how they responded. Instead, they responded in the same way that Cain responded, when Cain realized that God had favored his brother Abel. When Cain realized that Abel had God's favor, he was jealous. He was envious. And what did he do as a consequence of that envy? We're told that he hated his brother in his heart. And it is that visceral hatred. It is the brothers' hatred for the will of God and for their brother's welfare that has reduced this family to being a hot mess of simmering hostility. The wonderful testimony of the Scriptures, however, is that these are exactly the dark and desperate circumstances in which God accomplishes his most astonishing work. And that is because it is in circumstances like these that most clearly highlight the extraordinary depth of God's compassion and power. Because let me ask you a question. Who else but God was going to be willing to love a family like this? So broken, so filled with hatred, so oppositional to him and his will. Who else but God was going to be willing to love a family like this? And who else but the living God of heaven and earth would be capable of saving a family like this? Who else but the living God would be capable of bringing life and love out of the darkness that these hearts have been filled with, out of the darkness of hearts that have been so utterly corrupted with envy and hatred? But love and salvation are precisely what God had decided to give to this family. And he had determined to give them those things. He had determined to accomplish those things through Joseph. It is Joseph who has been called to rescue this family. It's Joseph who has been called to unify this fractured family. And in doing so, he will advance God's larger plan of salvation for the world. But in order to accomplish that purpose, Joseph would need to be brought down to Egypt. He was going to need to go to Egypt, and that is how we're going to shift our attention from this mess to the machinations. Now look, as we read through this passage, there are just so many warnings for us here. There are so many warnings for us as parents. There are warnings for us here as siblings. There are ethical and moral warnings for us here in these verses. But perhaps there is no greater and more crucial warning than being clear about the fact that what lives in the heart will come out in life. James will reflect on that later on in his epistle, when James will say, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and when it is fully grown, sin brings forth death." James 1:14 and 15. And that was surely the case for Joseph's brothers, whom we learn from the scriptures, both the passage that we've read in Genesis, but also Stephen's inspired commentary on these verses in Acts 7. We learn that the brothers are envious. They are jealous of Joseph. They desired what he had and what they hadn't been given. They desired their father's favor. They desired that position of preeminence that Joseph's cloak symbolized, and they desired the revelation of God that Joseph had received, and they hadn't. And that desire, when it has grown, gives birth to sin. And that sin, when it is fully grown, it gives birth to death. Or at least, what it gives birth to is a plan for death. Because that's what the brothers have devised as they saw Joseph coming towards them at Dothan. They devise a plan to kill him. Now, their plan was to murder him, to strip him of his cloak, and then to toss him in a nearby cistern. And then they were going to claim that he had been torn apart by a wild animal. And that wasn't by any means a statistical improbability at that time. And just as an aside here, I think it is worth noting that it is nothing short of astonishing that Father Jacob would have sent his 17-year-old son to make a 50-mile journey from Hebron to Shechem, and to have made that journey entirely by himself. Anyone at that time who made such a journey could have expected to be set upon either by bandits or by wild animals. And it is more than a little ironic then that at the end of the day, Joseph ends up being in more danger from his brothers than he does from the strangers whom he meets along the way. But I digress. Let's return to the wicked machinations of the brothers as they plot to do away with Joseph. Now, we're told that they came up with a plan after they had spotted Joseph coming towards them from a great distance. And apparently this didn't just give them enough time to devise this plan, it also ended up giving them enough time to rethink it. And that happens when their oldest brother Reuben intervened. And Reuben suggests that rather than bloodying their hands, why kill them yourself, right? Why actually literally get blood on your hands? Instead, let's take Joseph and we'll just toss him in a cistern. We'll toss him in this cistern and we'll leave him there to die. Now, our text tells us that Reuben suggested this course of action because he was planning to come back later. What he wanted to do was to return at a later point, get Joseph out of the well, and restore Joseph to his father. What we haven't been told is what motivated Reuben to do this. Some interpreters have conjectured that Reuben is trying to atone for his earlier affront to his father's dignity. If you turn back a few chapters, you'll discover that Reuben has grievously insulted his father, and he has done this by sleeping with one of his father's concubines. And so the suggestion is that perhaps Reuben is trying to restore his own relationship with his father by restoring to Joseph to him. Whatever the case may be, it certainly doesn't seem out of line to assume that Reuben was much more concerned with his own welfare than he was with Joseph's. We see that later on when Reuben comes back and he finds out that Joseph is gone. And what does Reuben say? "Where am I going to go?" Well, let's not worry about where you're going to go, Reuben. Let's worry about where Jacob is currently going, or Joseph is currently going, but whatever the case. Now, whatever the case may be, the brothers found this course of action agreeable. And when Joseph arrived, they set upon him, they stripped him of his robe, and then they tossed him in a cistern, after which they sat down for a meal. It is incredible that during the course of this meal, they turn a deaf ear to the cries of their brother. We're told in the scriptures that as Joseph was in the pit, he cried out to them. He called out to them for mercy. He called out to them for rescue. He begged them to bring him back up out of that pit. They did not listen. They callously sat there at the side of that pit and they ate a meal together. And we are reminded here of the callous behavior of the Roman soldiers who would strip Jesus, and after nailing him to the cross, sat in front of that cross and gambled for his clothing. There is a callousness here, a hardness of the human heart that is extraordinary. And so the brothers sit there, and they sit there eating their food, and they do so until such time as another brother comes up with a plan, and that brother is Judah. And Judah's plan sprang to mind when he saw a caravan of Ishmaelite traders headed their way. Now, these traders were on their way to Egypt. And Judah comes to the conclusion that, at the end of the day, dead is dead and gone is gone. But money is still money. And Judah concludes that there was a way to profit from their brother's demise. And the way to do that was to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who would then in turn sell Joseph in the slave markets of Egypt. And once again, the brothers agree that this is a great plan. This is a good idea. And so they drag Joseph up from the cistern, and then they turn around and they sell him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And the Ishmaelites will bring him down to Egypt, where they do in fact sell him in the slave markets. And he's sold into the service of one of Pharaoh's officials. He's sold into the service of Potiphar. And this is how Joseph makes his way from the pit to Potiphar. Now, the result of the brothers' machinations was enormous grief. Grief, first of all, for Joseph. Joseph must have been utterly stunned by what happened to him. He had, after all, in the blink of an eye, gone from being the favored son of a wealthy Near Eastern patriarch to a slave in a foreign land. And it must have been a heartbreaking, it must have been a shocking thing for Joseph to discover that the hatred that had lived in the hearts of his brothers, that hatred had crystallized into action, and that they had actually sought to put him to death. But there wasn't just grief for Joseph, there was grief for Jacob as well. Because the brothers, they take that robe and they slaughter a goat, and they dip the robe in the blood of a goat, and they send it ahead. They send it ahead to Jacob, and they say to Jacob, "Father, we found this robe. It's covered in blood. Would you confirm for us whether or not it is the robe that you gave to your son Joseph?" And when Joseph saw the robe, he realized that it was indeed Joseph's robe, and he broke down in grief, and he fell into a state of mourning that could not be relieved, would not be relieved for many long years to come. Of course, in an astonishing display of both cruelty and complicitness, the brothers proceed to play the role of comforter to a man whom they were collectively deceiving. And we can only pray that they felt the burden of that guilt weighing down on their hearts. Of course, while we can certainly empathize with Jacob's grief, what parent wouldn't grieve at the loss of the death of a child? The reality is that there continues to be an extraordinary irony here in this as well. Because you remember, if you turn back in Genesis, you discover that Jacob had deceived his own father with clothing that he had made from a slaughtered animal. And now Jacob gets deceived by those very same means himself. We are told in the scriptures by the Lord himself that God deals with us according to the measure that we have dealt with others. Jacob has been a deceiver. He has deceived his father, and now Jacob is deceived in the very same manner by his sons. And that is what motivated. Nevertheless, what we witness in the brothers' machinations is the horrible fruit of their hate-filled hearts. And their actions demonstrate the truth of what Jesus would later declare in the Sermon on the Mount, when he told his disciples that God doesn't just hate the physical act of murder, but he hates the root of murder, which is the envy and hatred that live first in the heart. And it is that hatred that motivated these men to sell their own flesh and blood into slavery. It is that hatred that convinced them that they could put an end to his dreaming, even as they lined their pockets with a little silver. Praise be to God, however, that what lived in the hearts of these brothers isn't really what was driving these events to occur. In fact, far from their hatred being the defining factor of this story, it is actually the sovereign love of God that is really in control of these things. And that's something that will become clear as we move from a consideration of the machinations of the brother to the mystery of this text. Now, you might wonder about that claim. How is it possible to claim that it is really the sovereign love of God that is being played out here in this chapter? And that's because if you look closely at this chapter, you'll find that God's name is never actually mentioned in this passage. There is no direct reference anywhere to the presence of God or to the activity of God here in these verses. And so at first glance, we might think that this whole series of events, that it actually appears to occur as a consequence, as a result of the brothers' hatred and their wickedness. And yet, while God isn't directly mentioned in this chapter, as one commentator has noted, his fingerprints are present throughout the whole passage. So how do we lift those fingerprints? How do we lift those fingerprints from the crime scene, so to say, in an effort to see how God is ultimately the one who has been directing the course of these events? Well, let's consider for just a few moments the apparent coincidences that are part of this story. First of all, as we've already noted, Joseph isn't harmed. He makes this 50-mile trek as a singular individual in a dangerous time, and yet he makes it. He gets all the way, that 50-mile journey, all the way to Shechem, and he does so without harm. Then when he arrives at Shechem, he discovers that his brothers aren't there, but a helpful stranger who just happens to have overheard the brothers' plans tells him to go to Dothan. There's a helpful stranger who's just conveniently there to direct him on his way. And then Reuben of all people, becomes the rescuer and deliverer of Joseph. And the cistern, it's interesting, these cisterns, these pits, they were holes that had been dug, and they'd been dug and they would be filled with water. These were cisterns that were intended to hold water and rainwater and such as a way of being able to water the flocks that were being shepherded in that area. Did you notice that it is very clearly mentioned that the cistern that Joseph is thrown into is empty? It's a dry cistern. There isn't 15 feet of water in there. Joseph doesn't have to tread. There's no danger of him drowning. And then there's this caravan, the caravan of Ishmaelites that just happens to go by while the brothers are eating their meal. And Joseph is ultimately sold into the service of Potiphar, who is a palace official of Pharaoh. And that is the same palace in which Joseph will be later elevated to become an official, whereby he will work to save his family and many people. This is also, incidentally, the same palace in which Moses will later be raised as a child of Pharaoh's daughter. And as we meditate on these things, we realize that there has been nothing random about them at all, because it's actually God. It's God who has sovereignly ordained these things to occur exactly as they have. And he's done so all in the service of carrying out his plan of saving both this family and a people. Loved ones, as we make our way through this chapter and the chapters that are to come, we've got to understand that all of these events, they need to be understood in light of what Joseph will say to his brothers in Genesis 50, verse 20. Because there, when the family is reunited, when they're reunited and Joseph reveals himself on their second trip, what does Joseph say to them? He says to the brothers, take heart. Take heart, because everything you meant for evil, everything you had undertaken as a way of hurting and harming, God has meant for good. God has meant these things for good. In fact, says Joseph, God always intended to use these things to keep many people alive. And those words are more than a little prophetic, because God didn't just mean to use these things to keep people alive during that famine that Joseph prepared for. He meant these things as a way of granting people new life in him. And once again, that's clear from the divine fingerprints that we can detect in this passage. Because think about it for a moment. Joseph is sold into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. And he's taken down to Egypt as a suffering servant, a servant whom God positions in such a way that he becomes the salvation of his people, a salvation that is seen in the repentance and reconciliation that will occur at the end of the story when Joseph and his brothers and his father are reunited. And they're reunited in love. They're reunited in peace. And as we think about those things, we come to understand that all along, God has been carefully weaving the story of Joseph into the story of his son, the promised son who would come and lead his people up out of bondage by crushing the head of the serpent, the promised son whom the scriptures have revealed to us as Jesus of Nazareth. This is his story. This is the story of Jesus Christ. It is the story of the salvation that is found in him. And if you have believed upon him, then the wondrous thing is that this is your story as well. Because for all of those who have believed on him, Jesus grants them the blessing of being adopted into his family, the family of God, which is the church. And those who are part of that family, they are part of the family of promise, the very same promises that were given to Abraham when God called him in a dream. When God called him in a dream to come up out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, to come out of the darkness of idolatry and hatred and envy, and to journey in faith to the land of promise. That, loved ones, is the resounding message of this text. And it is a gospel message because here in these words, this story of the generations of Jacob, God declares that in his mercy, he has delighted to love unworthy sinners like you and I. And he's testified that his plan of salvation for them is greater than all the evils of their hearts or of this world. And he has promised that in working out that plan of salvation in the lives of his people, that he will cause all things to work together for their good. And may knowing that cause you to be eager to come to Christ. May it move you and motivate you to come to him and to commend your life and your way to him. And if you're currently feeling like you are trapped in a pit, or worse yet, that you've been lifted out of the pit only to be sold off into slavery, then let me encourage you to take time to look for God's fingerprints in the events of your own life. You will surely find them there. And you will often find them in the seemingly small graces that we have a tendency to overlook. Sometimes the pit of our life is empty. Sometimes it's dry. We might not see the significance of that in the moment, but as we look back on it, we realize, oh, wait a minute, I did get tossed into a pit, but that pit was empty. It didn't have water in it. We look for the small mercies. They are there, and they are the indelible evidence of God's love for us. And they are a reminder that while your story might still be unfolding, and perhaps in ways that you can't always understand or appreciate just yet, you have been loved by the Lord. And therefore, you know how your story will end. And that is with the blessed salvation and rest that God has promised to grant to all of his people. Amen.